The whistle of the departing train echoed across the small station platform, leaving behind only dust, silence, and a handful of weary travelers. Among them sat Clara Bennett, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her single trunk pressed against her legs as though it were the only anchor she had left in the world. Her eyes followed the train until it became nothing more than a thin line of smoke on the horizon, and with it went the last familiar trace of home. Dot, for weeks, Clara, had clung to the promise of a new beginning. Letters had been exchanged with a man who claimed to be a rancher in need of a wife, someone practical, willing to work hard, and ready to make a home out of rough land. His words had not been particularly tender, but they had been steady, reliable, and they painted a picture of security Clara had never known. That was enough. At least, she thought it would be Dot now, sitting alone at the station. She began to wonder if she had been a fool, Dot around her. Other women were met with smiles, handshakes, even embraces. A girl with golden curls was swept into the arms of a clean-shaven farmer. Another, timid and plain, was greeted with nervous laughter from a lanky young man who had clearly never spoken to a woman before. Even the stern-looking widow in black was approached by a gray-haired shopkeeper who tipped his hat respectfully before leading her toward the waiting wagon. Dot. But for Clara, no one came. Dot. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the wooden platform. Her dress, chosen carefully for this very meeting, suddenly felt too heavy and too hot. She tugged at the sleeves, wishing she could disappear into the shadows. Snickers reached her ears. Two young boys delivering parcels pointed in her direction before being hushed by their mother. A pair of older women on a bench whispered behind lace gloves, their eyes flicking toward her with pity. "She's been left," one of them murmured, loud enough for Clara to hear. Imagine traveling all this way and no one waiting. Clara's stomach twisted. She wanted to stand, to say something sharp and clever in her defense, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she pressed her lips together and kept her gaze on the ground, counting the cracks between the wooden boards beneath her shoes. Dot. As the hours passed, her hope began to drain away. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps he had taken one. Look at her photograph, plain, unsmiling, taken in poor light, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. She couldn't blame him. Clara was no beauty. She was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a face that seemed too serious for a girl her age. Life had etched worry into her features long before it should have. Dot. The thought of returning home was unbearable. There was nothing for her there but endless work at her uncle's farm, where she was treated more like a servant than kin. This journey had been her one chance at escape, her fragile hope for belonging. And now it seemed even that had slipped away. Dot, her throat tightened as tears threatened, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not in front of strangers. She would endure as she always had. Yet the longer she sat alone on that hard bench, the more the weight of rejection pressed down upon her, crushing what little strength remained. Dot. By late afternoon, the platform had emptied. Wagons rolled away, wheels crunching over gravel. The air grew still, save for the creak of the station sign swaying in the wind. Clara was alone, completely and utterly alone. Dot. She drew a slow breath and whispered to herself, "No one is coming." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. She gathered her trunk, her movements stiff, and prepared to leave. Where she would go, she had no idea. But staying, sitting there like a forgotten parcel, was unbearable. Dot. Just as she rose, brushing dust from her skirt, a faint sound reached her ears. A child's voice, high and earnest, carrying across the quiet station. "Excuse me, miss," the voice said. Clara turned, startled. At the edge of the platform stood a little girl no taller than Clara's waist, her brown hair in uneven braids, her boots scuffed from play. She gazed up at Clara with eyes so full of determination it made Clara catch her breath. "My daddy needs a wife," the child declared firmly, her small hands clasped behind her back. "Will you come with us?" Clara froze, her heart pounding. For the first time that long and painful day, the silence was broken, not by mockery, not by pity, but by possibility. Clara's breath caught at the little girl's bold declaration, but before she could muster an answer, the child darted away toward the far end of the station platform. Clara's gaze followed and landed on a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with sunburnt skin and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the light. He stood stiffly, hands shoved in his pockets, as though reluctant even to be there. Her heart gave a sharp twist. Could this man be the one who had written to her? Could this child be his daughter? The thought should have ignited a flicker of hope, but instead it filled her with dread. He didn't move toward her, didn't lift his hand, didn't even tip his hat in greeting. Instead, he stood still as a fence post, his expression unreadable from a distance, and something in his posture told her what she had been trying so hard not to accept all day. He wasn't waiting for her. The truth pressed down heavy. The realization of rejection stung sharper than any words could. She had traveled for days, clutching those carefully folded letters to her chest, believing they were a promise. She had endured the suspicious glances of passengers, the uncomfortable questions from strangers about where she was going and whom she was meeting. She had told herself it was worth it, that at the end of this journey someone wanted her. But he wasn't here. The other brides had all been whisked away. She had watched as hands clasped hands, as laughter and relief mingled on faces both hopeful and nervous. Even the mismatched pairs, where the man looked uncertain and the woman shy, had at least walked away together. Together. That word clawed at Clara, because it was the very thing she had never been given. She remembered watching her cousins marry, their futures settled while she remained behind, tending livestock and mending shirts. She remembered how her uncle had once said, "A girl like you ought to be grateful for work. Men don't come seeking wives from plain stock." She had told herself he was wrong. She had believed the letters proved him wrong. Now the mocking whispers of the women on the bench replayed in her head. "She's been left." The words were cruel, but they were true. Her chest ached with humiliation. She could almost feel the eyes of the empty station pressing in on her, as though the ghosts of the departed passengers were still watching, judging, shaking their heads at her foolishness. She had made herself vulnerable, had dared to hope, and hope had betrayed her. The man at the far end of the platform shifted, bending to speak to his daughter. Clara forced herself to look away, clutching the handle of her trunk so tightly her knuckles ached. That little girl's voice had startled her, yes, but it hadn't changed the facts. No one had come for her. She thought of her meager coins tucked in her reticule. Not enough for another train ticket. Not enough for a decent room in town for more than a night or two. The thought of dragging her trunk back down the road, begging for odd work from strangers, filled her with despair. The sting of rejection turned quickly to fear. What would become of her now? Clara lowered herself back onto the bench, too weak to stand. The sharp edges of her trunk pressed against her knees, grounding her to reality. Her hands trembled as she rested them in her lap. She wished she could fold into herself and vanish. She wished the ground would open beneath her and swallow her whole, sparing her the humiliation of facing another hour in this place. And yet, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the platform, Clara realized she couldn't give up. Not yet. She had endured hardship before. She had survived loneliness before. This was not the end, though it felt like it. She forced her chin up, blinking away the hot sting in her eyes. She would not let them see her cry. Not the gossips, not the station master who cast her sideways. Glances, not even the tall stranger with the daughter. Her heart, however, told a different story. Deep inside, something fragile cracked. The letters, the dream, the possibility of belonging. It all seemed foolish now. A cruel trick played by fate. She whispered the words again, softer this time, as though speaking them might harden her resolve. No one is coming. And yet, even as she said it, the memory of that small, steady voice tugged at her. My daddy needs a wife. The pain of rejection was sharp and undeniable, but buried within it was something else, an echo of possibility. She dared not believe. The sun had dipped low enough to stain the horizon with streaks of gold and rose when Clara heard it again, the small, insistent voice. Excuse me, miss. Clara's head turned sharply, her heart giving a startled leap. The little girl stood, just a few feet away now, closer than before. In the fading light, Clara could see her more clearly. Her boots were scuffed, her dress patched at the elbows, and her braids were uneven, as though they had been plaited by clumsy fingers, rather than a mother's careful hands. Yet her eyes, earnest, wide, and the exact shade of the prairie sky before rain, held a courage beyond her years. Clara blinked, uncertain how to respond. Her tongue felt heavy, as though the very act of speech might shatter the fragile composure she'd managed to hold all afternoon. Yes, she managed at last, her voice low. The little girl clasped her hands in front of her and lifted her chin in a way that reminded Clara of a soldier standing at attention. My daddy needs a wife, she said again, her words slow and deliberate, as if they were an important announcement rather than a childish whim. You look nice. I think you do. Clara's breath caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. No one had spoken to her with such directness in a very long time. For a moment she could only stare, stunned by the innocence and boldness bundled together in that small figure. Your... What? Clara stammered, finally finding her voice. The girl's little shoulders squared. My mama's in heaven. Daddy says so, but he works too hard. He needs someone who can make biscuits and read stories. He don't know I'm asking, she added, glancing over her shoulder at the tall man still waiting at the far end of the platform. But I heard him say the nights are awful quiet. Clara followed the girl's gaze. The man still hadn't moved closer. His hat shadowed his face, but she could feel his discomfort even from this distance, as if he'd rather face down a charging bull than confront her. The little girl tugged at Clara's sleeve, demanding attention again. Would you come with us? We got a big ranch. I'd help you. Clara's chest tightened. The ache of rejection she had carried all day warred with a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. The earnestness in the child's tone stirred places in her heart she had long since locked away. The longing to be needed, to belong, to have a place in someone's life. But it was absurd, wasn't it? She couldn't just walk away with strangers, on the word of a child. And yet what choice did she have? Go back? To where? There was no home for her to return to. Her uncle's farm was as cold as stone. Her coins were nearly gone. Sweetheart? Clara crouched slightly, so she was nearer, the girl's eye level, her skirts brushing the dusty boards of the platform. Does your daddy know you're asking me this? The child's mouth twisted guiltily, but her determination didn't falter. Not yet. But he will. He just needs a push. Clara almost smiled despite herself. The girl's stubborn courage reminded her of her younger self, back before years of disappointment had worn her down. She wanted to believe this small voice could change everything, but fear still clung tightly to her ribs. She glanced again at the man. His posture was rigid, his gaze turned away, though his hand rested gently on the handle of the wagon beside. A protective gesture. Was it reluctance that held him back, or grief? Whatever the reason, Clara knew she stood on a knife's edge. Her pride whispered that she should walk away, that she had suffered enough humiliation for one day. But the child's words echoed louder in her heart. My daddy needs a wife. You. Look nice. I think you do. The simplicity of it pierced her defenses. The girl saw no flaws, no unworthiness, no plainness, only possibility. Clara straightened slowly, her gloved hands smoothing her skirt. Why don't we ask your daddy what he thinks? She said softly. The little girl's face lit with triumph, as if she had known Clara would agree all along. She grasped Clara's hand, small fingers curling tightly around hers, and began tugging her toward the tall stranger waiting in the lengthening shadows. Each step was heavy with uncertainty. Clara's heart pounded, her thoughts a tumble of fear and wonder. She had come expecting nothing more than rejection, but now she was being pulled toward something entirely unexpected. The little girl's small hand was surprisingly strong as she pulled Clara across the empty platform. Each step echoed in Clara's ears like a drumbeat, steady and unrelenting. The late light slanted across the boards, casting long shadows that stretched toward the tall man who waited at the end, shoulders rigid, face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Clara's pulse quickened. Every instinct told her to stop, to turn back before she made a fool of herself. This man hadn't sought her out. His silence and distance said as much. And yet, she allowed the child to guide her, her heart suspended between fear and something dangerously close to yearning. When they reached him, the girl let go of Clara's hand and planted herself squarely between the two adults, as though she were a bridge binding them together. She looked up at her father with all the boldness of a general delivering orders. "Daddy, this is her," she announced proudly. "She can be our wife." The man's head jerked back slightly, as though the words were a physical blow. For a moment he said nothing. His gaze, gray, cool, and guarded, lifted to Clara, scanning her face with a flicker of something between wariness and surprise. He straightened, removing his hat at last. He was younger than Clara expected. Perhaps no more than 35, though grief had carved lines into the corners of his eyes. His hair was dark, with a few strands of silver at the temples that caught the fading light. He held himself like a man accustomed to labor and solitude, broad and steady, but with the air of someone who kept the world at arm's length. "Ma'am," he said at last, his voice low and rough as gravel. He inclined his head politely, but his eyes shifted toward his daughter, narrowing with disapproval. "What have I told you about pestering strangers?" "I'm not pestering," the girl replied with the certainty only a child could muster. "You said you were lonely. You said you needed help. Well, she's here. God sent her. The man—" pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly torn between scolding and surrendering to his daughter's determination. His sigh carried the weight of years. "Hattie—" Clara blinked at the name. "Hattie." It suited the little girl's stubborn sweetness. "She's right, you know," Clara said softly before she could stop herself. Her voice wavered, but the words felt true. "Children hear more than we realize." The man's gaze snapped back to her, sharp and searching. She swallowed hard, suddenly wishing she'd stayed silent. But his eyes lingered, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. It wasn't admiration, nothing so gentle, but an appraisal, as though he were trying to decide what sort of woman would let herself be dragged into such a situation. At last, he exhaled slowly and set his hat against his chest. "I reckon there's been some misunderstanding, ma'am. I didn't send for you. I'm sorry if you were expecting—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Well, whoever he was, he's not me." The words, though spoken gently, cut deep. Clara's throat ached with shame, and she looked down quickly to hide it. Of course he hadn't sent for her. She had known that in her bones the moment the train pulled away and no one claimed her. Still, hearing it spoken aloud burned like salt in a wound. Before she could retreat, however, Hattie slipped her small hand back into Clara's, holding fast. "But you need someone, Daddy. You can't do everything alone. And I like her." The man's stern expression faltered. He looked at his daughter, and in that brief, unguarded moment, Clara saw the depth of weariness in his eyes. He loved this child fiercely. That much was clear. But love alone could not mend loneliness, nor keep a household running on its own. Clara found her voice again, though it trembled. "She's a brave little girl. Braver than I am, I think." She glanced toward the horizon, then back at him. I don't know what I'll do next. But perhaps she's right about one thing. Sometimes God sends us what we need in ways we don't expect." The man's jaw tightened again, but this time he didn't argue. Instead, he studied Clara with that same measuring gaze, as though weighing the risks of letting a stranger step closer to the fragile world he and his daughter had built. For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, the widowed rancher, his determined child, and the weary woman who had thought herself abandoned. The air was thick with things unsaid, with possibilities that neither dared to name. Finally, he nodded once, curtly. "My name's Luke Carter," he said. "This here's Hattie. If you've nowhere else to go tonight, you can ride with us. But understand," his voice hardened slightly, "I don't make promises I can't keep." Relief and fear mingled in Clara's chest. It wasn't an invitation of love or even acceptance, but it was something. A place to rest her head, a chance, however fragile. And as Hattie beamed and squeezed her hand, Clara realized that maybe, just maybe, the path she was meant to walk had only just begun. The wagon rattled along the rutted road, its wheels creaking with every bump. Clara sat stiffly on the wooden bench beside Luke Carter, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Hattie nestled between them, humming softly as though she had just accomplished the greatest victory of her young life. Clara stared straight ahead, the vast expanse of prairie stretching endlessly before her. Golden grasses rippled like waves in the evening breeze, and the horizon glowed with the last light of day. It was beautiful, wild, untamed, and more than a little frightening. She had dreamed of wide-open skies and a place to belong, but now that she was here, doubt gnawed at her. Luke had spoken little since offering her the ride. His presence was solid, steady, but the silence pressed heavy, broken only by Hattie's occasional chatter. Clara could feel his guardedness, as tangible as the distance he kept between them on the bench. At last, he cleared his throat. "You should know, ma'am, I don't take kindly to surprises. My daughter has a mind of her own, but I never asked her to go running off making such requests." Clara nodded, though her cheeks flushed. "I understand. She only spoke because she cares for you." He glanced at her then, just briefly, before fixing his gaze back on the road. "That may be, but this—" He shook his head. "This isn't the sort of thing you rush into. Marriage ain't a business deal you settle in a moment. It's a binding, a responsibility." His words stung, though he hadn't meant them cruelly. Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I never imagined it would be easy, but sometimes a woman doesn't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect arrangement. Sometimes she only has the choice of surviving, or not." Her voice trembled on the last word, and she hated herself for the weakness it revealed. Yet it was the truth. She had no home to return to, no family who wanted her, no money to make a new start elsewhere. Luke's grip tightened on the reins. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady clop of the horse's hooves. Finally, he spoke, his tone lower, more thoughtful. I lost my wife 4 winters back, buried her up on the ridge, where the wildflowers bloom come spring. Since then, it's been just me and Hattie. I've done my best, but a ranch is a heavy load for one man, and a little girl needs more than a father who's bone-tired at the end of every day. Clara's heart clenched. His honesty was unexpected, and it softened the stern image she had of him. He wasn't just a hard man, he was a wounded one, he went on. I can't offer much. The land's rough, the work's endless, and money runs thinner every season. I won't promise you comfort or ease. What I can promise is an honest days. Work and a roof over your head. But if you're thinking on staying, it wouldn't be as a guest. Clara turned her head to look at him. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but she could hear the weight in his words. This wasn't just courtesy. It was a proposition, plain, unadorned, risky as the wide prairie itself. You mean, she whispered. He nodded once. Marriage. In name, at least. For Hattie's sake. For the ranch's sake. You'd have a place. And she'd have a mother again. The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet, though the wagon wheels kept turning. Marriage. He was offering her the very thing she had traveled all this way for, though not from the man she had expected, and not with the tenderness she had once dreamed of. It was a proposition born of necessity, not love. Yet wasn't necessity what had driven her here? She looked down at Hattie, who leaned against her side, eyelids growing heavy with sleep. The child trusted her already as though she belonged. Clara's heart softened, aching with a longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She lifted her gaze back to Luke. I don't need comfort, she said quietly. I've never had it, but I do need a place. And I think your daughter needs me as much as I need her. His eyes flickered toward her then, meeting hers for a brief searching moment. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding. Tentative and fragile, but real. The wagon jolted over a rut, and the silence stretched again. But this time it wasn't heavy with rejection. It was weighted with the possibility of something new, something neither of them had planned, but both might learn to hold. The Carter Ranch stretched wide beneath the open sky, a patchwork of weathered fences, grazing cattle, and fields that needed more tending than one man and a child could manage. As the wagon rattled into the yard that first evening, Clara's breath caught. She had seen farms before, had worked them even, but this was harsher, lonelier. The house stood square and plain, its paint long since worn away by wind and sun. A few shingles were missing on the roof. The barn leaned slightly to one side, its doors hanging askew. Everything spoke of hard labor and harder survival. Clara stepped down from the wagon, her boots crunching against the packed earth. Hattie bounded ahead, eager to show her new companion every corner of her world, but Clara lingered near the steps of the porch. She felt like an intruder, as though she had stepped into a life that might yet reject her. Luke lifted her trunk with ease, carrying it inside without a word. He set it at the foot of a narrow bed in the small spare room and gave a curt nod. This'll do for now. Clara smoothed her skirt, murmuring her thanks. But once he left her alone, the weight of uncertainty pressed in. She had agreed, tentatively, quietly, to his proposition. Yet what did that mean in practice? Was she merely a helper? A placeholder? Could she make herself useful enough to earn her place here? The next morning brought no time for questions. At dawn, the rooster's crow pulled her from restless sleep. She found the kitchen dim and cold, a few jars on the shelf, a half-empty sack of flour on the counter. The remnants of a household once cared for by loving hands, but those hands were long gone. Clara rolled up her sleeves. By the time Luke returned from the barn, she had biscuits baking in the oven, bacon sizzling in a skillet, and coffee steaming on the stove. The smells filled the air, and for a fleeting moment, the house felt alive. Hattie clapped her hands with delight. "I told you she could make biscuits, Daddy." Luke said nothing at first, only sat at the table, his expression unreadable. But when he bit into the warm biscuit, a flicker of something softened in his eyes. He nodded once. Good. That one word, simple as it was, steadied Clara's resolve. The days fell into rhythm, though each brought new challenges. Clara learned the chores of the ranch quickly, gathering eggs, hauling water, mending torn shirts and worn curtains. She scrubbed floors that had long been neglected, shook dust from linens, and coaxed warmth back into rooms that felt cold and abandoned. But the work outside the house was harder still. Luke showed her how to drive the wagon, how to fetch supplies from town, and how to mend a section of broken fence. Her hands blistered, her muscles ached, and more than once she doubted whether she was strong enough. Yet every evening, when Hattie slipped her small hand into hers with quiet trust, Clara felt the doubts ease. Still, Luke remained distant. He thanked her when thanks were due, offered instruction when she faltered, but kept his words spare. At meals, he listened more than he spoke. At night, he retired early, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts in the dim lamplight. He was polite, always respectful, but there was a wall around him she could not scale. Whispers in town added to her unease. On her first trip to the mercantile, Clara overheard two women murmur, "That must be the new one. Poor thing. He won't. Let her near his heart. She's just there for the work." The words stung, though she tried to brush them off. Perhaps they were right. But when she returned home and found Hattie waiting on the porch, her face bright with joy, Clara realized the girl's acceptance mattered more than anyone else's opinion. Gradually, small moments began to stitch themselves into something more. The evening Hattie fell asleep at the table, Clara carried her gently to bed. When she returned, she found Luke watching, his expression unreadable but softer than before. Another time, when Clara tripped in the barn and nearly dropped a pail of milk, Luke caught her elbow, steadying her. Their eyes met for a brief instant, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was charged with something unspoken. Clara knew better than to call it affection. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Adjusting to ranch life was no easy task, but as days turned into weeks, Clara began to realize she had found something she'd never had before. A place where her work mattered, where her presence filled a need. She still feared rejection, still wondered if Luke's heart would ever open to her. Yet every time Hattie slipped her hand into hers, Clara felt a seed of belonging take root. The first weeks on the ranch had given Clara a rhythm, but as summer deepened, challenges began to creep in. Quiet at first, then loud enough to shake the fragile foundation she was building. It began with the whispers in town growing sharper. Each trip to the mercantile brought new stares, new muttered judgments. Some pitied her. Poor girl, taken in by Carter, but not as a real wife. Others sneered, a woman with no family, no name worth speaking of, clinging where she isn't wanted. Clara kept her chin high, but each word lodged like a thorn beneath her skin. Luke heard the talk too. Though he said nothing, Clara could see the way his jaw tightened when neighbors greeted her too coldly, or when a storekeeper's wife made a pointed remark. His silence was its own kind of protection, but also a wall. He didn't defend her, aloud, didn't claim her openly. And so, the rumors lingered like dust that no scrubbing could remove. Then came the work itself. A summer storm rolled in one evening, black clouds swallowing the horizon. Wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows of the little house. Clara rushed to bring in linens from the line, her skirts whipping around her legs. Lightning cracked, illuminating the barn in stark white light. Luke shouted over the thunder, ordering her to stay inside. But Clara refused to cower. She followed him out into the storm, clutching a lantern against the gale. Together they fought to secure the barn doors, the rain lashing against their faces, mud sucking at their boots. Hattie stood in the doorway of the house, crying for her father and Clara to come back. When the wind nearly ripped the lantern from Clara's hands, Luke cursed under his breath and seized her arm. "You'll get yourself killed out here!" "I won't leave you to do it alone," she shouted back, her hair plastered against her cheeks. For a moment, their eyes locked, his fierce with fear, hers blazing with stubbornness. Then, silently, he accepted her presence. Side by side, they battled the storm until the barn stood secured. Only then did he drag her back to the porch, both of them soaked and breathless, inside, as Hattie clung to them. Luke's hand lingered on Clara's shoulder longer than it needed to. Something in his gaze shifted, as though he had seen her strength in a new light. But storms did not end with the weather. The ranch's finances weighed heavily. Clara overheard Luke late one night speaking with a neighbor who had stopped by. "I'll be lucky to hold on to half the herd come winter," he admitted. "Prices keep falling. Fences need mending faster than I can patch 'em. And now with another mouth to feed—" Clara had retreated before they noticed her, shame tightening in her chest. She had thought she was helping, but what if she was only a burden? What if she was the very thing that tipped the balance? Her fears gnawed at her in quiet moments. She scrubbed harder, worked longer, pushed herself to prove her worth. Yet still, she saw Luke's guardedness, his reluctance to let her closer. He was kind, yes, respectful, always. But at night, when he closed his bedroom door, Clara lay awake in her own small room, listening to the silence that stretched between them. Sometimes she wondered if he only tolerated her because of Hattie. The child's laughter and affection were constant, her small arms wrapping around Clara's waist, her innocent voice declaring, "You're ours now!" Those moments filled Clara with warmth, but also with a piercing ache. Because what if Hattie was wrong? What if Luke never truly wanted her? One evening, as they sat at supper, Clara dared to voice it. "Do you regret letting me stay?" she asked, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her fork. Luke froze, his eyes flicking to Hattie, then back to Clara. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "I don't regret it," he said at last, his tone quiet but firm. "But I'm not ready for more than what we agreed to." The words landed heavy, though spoken with honesty. Clara forced a nod, blinking hard to keep her composure. She reminded herself that survival was enough, that belonging to Hattie's world was more than she'd ever dared hope for. And yet, deep inside, her heart whispered for something more, for affection, for tenderness, for love. The struggles and storms of the ranch had shown her strength she hadn't known she possessed, but they had also revealed the cracks in the fragile arrangement she shared with Luke. If the storms outside could shake the walls of the barn, the storms within could do the same to her heart. Still, as she tucked Hattie into bed that night. Listening to the girl's whispered prayers, Clara realized she wasn't ready to give up. Storms might test her, but they would not break her. Not when there was still hope, however small, that this place, this family, might yet become her own. The days following the storms carried with them an odd sort of quiet. Not the silence of distance, though Luke still kept his heart guarded, but a hush that felt like possibility. Something had shifted in the way he looked at Clara. Hesitant, yes, but no longer as if she were a stranger intruding on his life. Instead, there was a flicker of recognition, as though he was beginning to see her as someone who belonged. It began with small things. One morning, Clara found a new pair of sturdy gloves folded neatly on the porch rail. She hadn't said aloud that the old pair blistered her hands, but somehow Luke had noticed. When she looked up to thank him, he only nodded, muttering that work got done faster if no one was slowed down by sore palms. Yet his ears flushed pink under the brim of his hat as he strode away. Later that week, while Hattie skipped in the yard, Clara joined Luke in the pasture. Together, they worked to mend a sagging fence. At first, Luke kept his instructions short, his voice clipped, as if expecting her to fumble. But when Clara proved steady with the hammer, he paused to watch her. "You're stronger than you look," he admitted. Clara smiled faintly, brushing sweat from her brow. "Hardship teaches you things. You either get stronger or you break." Something softened in his expression, just for a moment, before he bent back to his work. Those moments, brief, fleeting, were what Clara held on to. They were the threads she stitched into hope. Hattie, ever the little matchmaker, played her part with innocent determination. She began arranging suppers so that Clara sat beside her father. She tugged both their hands during walks, making them link together when crossing a stream. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she leaned against Clara and announced matter-of-factly, "Papa, she laughs at your jokes more than anyone. That means she likes you." Luke had grumbled and changed the subject, but Clara noticed how his eyes lingered on her when the child wasn't looking. The ranch, too, began to feel less like a place she was staying and more like a home. She planted flowers by the front steps, coaxing life from the dry soil. She patched curtains for the windows and polished the wooden table until it gleamed. It was still rough living, but with every small touch, Clara felt her heart rooting itself deeper into the land and the family who occupied it. One Sunday afternoon, Luke surprised her by suggesting they ride into town together. Clara hesitated. She knew the whispers would not have died down. Yet she agreed, reminding herself she wasn't the same woman who had sat trembling on the station bench weeks before. At the general store. She felt the weight of curious eyes, but when a bold woman remarked, "Didn't expect to see Carter bringing company," Luke's hand found the small of Clara's back. The gesture was brief, protective, and almost unconscious, but it was enough to silence the sneer. Clara's heart fluttered with a warmth that carried her all the way home. Still, Luke's walls were not fully lowered. Clara sensed it in the way his words often caught in his throat, in the hesitation before his gaze met hers. Yet she also sensed his longing. He watched her when she brushed Hattie's hair, his eyes filled with something more than gratitude. He lingered at the table after meals, as though reluctant to leave her company. One evening, after a long day of labor, Clara stepped outside to find him standing beneath the stars. The air was cool, crickets chirping in the tall grass. For a moment, she only stood beside him, both gazing upward. "My wife used to love nights like this," he said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken of her. She said the sky was God's reminder that we're small but not forgotten. Clara's breath caught. She could hear the ache in his voice, the tenderness hidden beneath his strength. She longed to reach for his hand but held herself still. Instead, she whispered, "She sounds like she was a good woman." "She was," Luke replied. His jaw tightened, but then he looked at Clara. "And you've brought something back to this place. To me, I just don't know what to do with it yet." The admission, raw and unpolished, struck deeper than any practiced words of affection could have. Clara's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy that he was beginning to open, sorrow that fear still chained him. That night, as she lay awake, Clara realized that affection was no longer something she merely hoped for. It was here, fragile but real, blooming between them like the flowers she had planted by the steps. Love was not yet spoken, but it lived in the quiet gestures, in the shared labors, in the laughter of a child binding them together. The summer sun had burned hot for weeks, and though Clara was still learning the rhythm of ranch life, even she could sense the tension building in the air. The cattle were restless, the ground dry and cracked, and Luke seemed more on edge with each passing day. He rose earlier, worked longer, and though his words to her were kind enough, there was a sharpness in his movements that betrayed his worry. Clara tried to ease the burden where she could. She cooked hearty meals, kept Hattie, entertained, and even rode out to deliver water to the men in the fields. But she could feel the weight pressing down on him, a man who carried both his land and his little girl's future on his shoulders. The crisis came suddenly. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered, rolling across the sky with a violence that made Clara's heart race. Within moments, a storm broke, thunder cracked like cannon fire, rain poured in torrents, and lightning struck dangerously close to the pasture. The cattle panicked. From the porch, Clara saw them surge like a living river, hooves pounding the earth as they bolted toward the far fence. Luke was already there, shouting commands to the ranch hands, his body tense as he fought to turn the herd before they trampled the fencing, or worse, ran straight into the gully beyond. "Stay inside." "With Hattie!" Luke had shouted before galloping off on his horse, but Clara couldn't just stand by. From the window, she saw the men struggling, the herd wild with fear, and Luke riding dangerously close to the front, risking himself to stop them. Her hands shook as she gathered Hattie, pressing the little girl's face against her skirt so she wouldn't see her father nearly thrown from the saddle. Every instinct in Clara screamed to do something. But what could she do against a stampede? Then, through the chaos, a cry pierced the storm. It was Hattie's voice, high and terrified. She had slipped from Clara's grasp, running out into the rain-soaked yard, calling for her father. "No, Hattie!" Clara's scream tore from her throat as she sprinted after the child. The ground was slick with mud, rain blinding her eyes, but she managed to catch Hattie's arm just as the girl reached the fence. Clara pulled her close, shielding her with her own body as the thunder rolled overhead. The cattle weren't far. She could feel the ground trembling beneath their charge. For one terrifying moment, Clara thought they might break through and crush them both. And then Luke was there. He swung from his horse in a single motion, grabbing Hattie into his arms and pulling Clara close with his other hand. His face was pale, his eyes blazing with fear and fury. But he didn't waste words. Together, they stumbled back toward the house, the rain lashing at their faces, the stampede finally veering away under the frantic work of the ranch hands. Inside, soaked. And trembling, Clara sank into a chair with Hattie still clinging to her. Luke dropped to one knee in front of them, his big hands trembling as he cupped his daughter's face, making sure she was safe. When he was satisfied, he turned his gaze to Clara. "You could have been killed," he said hoarsely. His voice shook, not with anger, but with the raw edge of terror. "I couldn't let her run out there alone," Clara whispered, her arms tightening around Hattie. "I had to protect her." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the pounding rain against the roof. Luke's chest rose and fell as though he'd run a mile. Then, slowly, he reached out, his rough hand brushing a strand of wet hair from Clara's cheek. "You're braver than you know," he said softly. His eyes held hers, unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. "And I don't know what I'd have done if I lost either of you tonight." The words struck deep, breaking something open in both of them. Clara felt tears sting, her eyes not from fear but from the realization that beneath all his walls, Luke cared, truly cared. Not just for his daughter, but for her as well. In that storm's aftermath, they sat together, holding Hattie between them, the girl's small, hands clutching tightly at both of theirs. The house shook with the wind outside, but inside, something steadier was taking root. Luke had faced the possibility of loss again, and it had forced him to admit what he'd been too afraid to say. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the land, drenched and quiet, as if the very earth was sighing in relief. The cattle had been corralled safely, the fences patched where they'd splintered, and the ranch hands returned exhausted but intact. Inside the little ranch house, however, the storm had left more than broken branches and muddy ground. It had shifted something inside Luke and Clara, something both had resisted for too long. Clara awoke in the small bed she now called hers, the quilt heavy and warm around her shoulders. For a moment she lay still, listening to the soft breathing of Hattie curled up beside her, the child having refused to sleep alone after the fright of the night before. Clara brushed a damp curl from the girl's forehead, her heart tightening, with a strange, fierce love she had never expected to feel. She was not Hattie's mother by birth, but in her heart, she was already bound to this child, When she rose and padded softly into the kitchen, she found Luke already there, his broad frame hunched over a mug of coffee, the lines of fatigue sharp around his eyes. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable at first. Clara froze, uncertain whether the storm had loosened his walls or rebuilt them higher. "You should still be resting," he said quietly, his voice rough but gentler than she'd heard it before. "So should you," she replied, attempting a small smile. Her hands busied themselves with preparing breakfast, if only to give her something to do. She cracked eggs into a pan, the familiar motions grounding her as the silence stretched between them. At last, Luke pushed back his chair. His boots sounded heavy against the wooden floor as he crossed to her side. Clara stilled, heart pounding, her hands gripping the wooden spoon as though it might steady her. "Clara," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "Last night, I realized something." She turned, her breath caught in her throat. He stood so close now, the warmth of his presence wrapping around her like the quilt had earlier. His hat was gone, his hair still damp from the storm, and his eyes, oh, his eyes, held nothing back. "For so long I've been afraid to let anyone near me or Hattie. Losing my wife near broke me, and I thought the only way to survive was to shut it all out. But you—" His throat worked as he searched for the words. "You walked into our lives when we weren't looking for you. And somehow, you've become part of everything. Hattie needs you, and so do I." Clara's hands trembled. She set the spoon down with a soft clatter, hardly able to breathe. "Luke, I don't have fancy words, and I don't have much to give," he said, his voice breaking with sincerity. "But I do know this. I don't want you to ever feel abandoned again. I want you here, with us, as my wife." The world seemed to go still. Clara had dreamed of belonging, of being chosen, for so long that the very idea of it felt unreal. Tears blurred her vision, spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "Are you sure? Truly sure?" He reached for her hands, his calloused fingers curling around hers with a tenderness that undid her. "I've never been more sure of anything." It was then that small footsteps pattered into the room. Hattie rubbed her sleepy eyes, then broke into a bright grin when she saw them standing. "Close!" Without hesitation, she wrapped her little arms around both their legs. "Does this mean you're gonna marry my daddy?" she asked, her voice hopeful and certain all at once. Clara laughed through her tears, bending down to scoop the girl into her arms. She looked at Luke over Hattie's shoulder, her heart full to bursting. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady now. "Yes, it does." Luke's face broke into something rare and beautiful, a smile unguarded, full of relief and joy. He reached out, pulling both Clara and Hattie into his embrace. The three of them stood there in the kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows, wrapping them in gold dot outside comma the ranch carried on, men mending fences, cattle grazing, quietly. But inside that little home, a new family had been formed. Not by chance, not by convenience, but by choice and by love. Clara no longer felt the sting of being left behind. She was no longer the woman sitting on a train platform with nothing but a battered trunk and fading hope. She was a wife, a mother, and a cherished heart at the center of a family she had never dared to imagine. And as Luke pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, she knew with unshakable certainty that she had finally come home.